Hello everyone, and welcome to another English Grammar with Max. Today we want to talk about relative clauses. But first, let's see what a relative clause is. Relative clauses give more information about something or a subject or an object in a sentence. For example, this is the man who lives here. This clause, which we call relative clause, is giving more information about the man. He lives here, so we call it a relative clause. The person, what person, who talked to me was a doctor. Again, this is your relative clause, giving more information about, or giving information about someone or something you're talking about. The device which we use, giving information about this device, this is a relative clause, is expensive. We have, and we call these relative pronoun. This is a relative pronoun. We have a lot of relative pronouns. For example, we have, as we can see here, who, whom, that, where, when, why, and some more of them. So these are what we call relative pronouns, and we are going to talk about some of them today and some rules about relative clauses. Okay, first let's talk about who and whom. Let's see some examples and I'll explain on the examples. The person who killed him is in prison. As we have already discussed, this is your relative clause and who is your relative pronoun. But who in this clause is the subject, the doer of the action. That is the difference between who and whom. When we use who, you should be describing the subject of the sentence. If this is the object of the sentence or the clause, you need to use whom. But listen, whom is rarely used these days, especially in spoken English. So it is mostly used in formal language. Or for example, when you're writing a formal letter, you'd better use whom instead of who if it is an object. But the thing is, some people prefer to use whom instead of who when it is correct. But when you are speaking, the bottom line, when you are speaking, you don't have to use whom at all. You could say who all the time in all these structures, except for this one I'll explain. So, the person who killed him is in prison. We use who and whom for persons only. The woman whom I talked to, because the woman or whom in this clause is the object of the sentence. That is why we can use whom. Whom I talked to was old. And again, if you want to make it even more formal, you can bring this preposition before whom. Actually, a lot of linguists or a lot of English speakers believe that we cannot finish a sentence or a clause with a preposition, sometimes even think of it as inappropriate. So, if you want to be 100% certain, I recommend you bring preposition before whom if your main verb has a preposition. And the last example is talk to someone whom you trust. Again, you could say who, but we can also use whom in here because this is the recipient of the action. So this is the object of your clause, not the subject. The next relative pronoun is whose. We use whose when we want to show possession or belonging. The man whose car was stolen. First, whose car was stolen is our relative clause. But how could we tell if we need to use who or whose? It's very simple. Listen, the word or the phrase after whose should belong the word or the phrase before whose. So now the car belongs to the man. so you could use whose. The man whose car was stolen is here. The next example is, I talked to the woman whose son has died. Again, this is a little bit morbid of an example, but we are living in morbid times right now. I talked to the woman whose son has died. And again, son belongs to the woman, so the word or the phrase after whose belongs to the word or the phrase before whose. The last example, look, there is a basic difference between these examples and this example in here. Whose, we don't only use it for people, we could also use it for things. Look, this is the computer whose hard drive was removed. Again, this is your relative clause, and the hard drive belongs to the computer. So we not only use whose with people, we could also use it with things. The next relative pronoun is which we use for things. The vaccine which cures corona will come out soon. This is what we call wishful thinking in English. The vaccine which cures corona, because we are talking about a vaccine, a thing. So, and this is your relative clause. The book which you lent me was lost. And which you lent me, again, because we are talking about a book, that is a thing, we use which as our relative pronoun. The next thing we want to talk about is very important, so listen very carefully. We have two types of relative clauses. One we call defining relative clauses. The other type we call non-defining relative clauses. Telling the difference between a defining relative clauses and a non-defining one is very important, and at the same time, if you pay close attention, it's pretty easy. The doctor, look at this example as a defining relative clause. The doctor who treated me was a specialist. If you want to find out if this is a non-defining or a defining relative clause, first you need to find it in the sentence. Who treated me? So this is your relative clause. Then you need to ask yourselves if this clause is giving me essential information or extra information. And the easiest way to tell if a clause or if a piece of information is essential or extra is that you remove it from the sentence and see if the sentence still makes sense. The doctor who treated me was a specialist. Let's remove it from the sentence. The doctor was a specialist. And if you don't know which doctor that person is talking about, we cannot know the meaning of this sentence or the purpose of this sentence. So actually, who treated me is giving essential information about the doctor. It is making this doctor unique among all other doctors. So it is singling out this doctor from a group of other doctors, or all the other doctors for that matter. So the doctor who treated me, this is giving us essential information about the doctor or what it is defining, so we call it a defining relative clause. Now look at this example in here as a non-defining relative clause. This pen, which I bought 20 years ago, it still works fine. So how could we tell if this is a non-defining relative clause? Again, we remove it from the sentence. This pen still works fine because you are using this. You are not saying the. You are showing it to somebody, this pen, so it doesn't need any defining anymore. It has already been defined by the word this. So this is giving extra information. So again, remember, punctuation is very important in a non-defining relative clause. Sometimes, actually, punctuation is the only thing we have to realize if this is a defining clause or a non-defining clause. Because with non-defining relative clauses, we always have to use punctuation. It means it could be between two commas, or it could be between a comma and a full stop at the end of the sentence. Okay, 2 points about relative clauses. First point, I say with an example. The letter arrived today, which was too late. This is, again, because of the punctuation in here and also because of the meaning of the sentence. This relative clause is giving us extra information about the event. But remember, why I have written this example, because the relative clause does not only replace a noun or a noun phrase. It could replace an entire clause, like the letter arrived today, which is the pronoun, which is replacing the whole event, the whole clause, or it is replacing the fact that the letter arrived today. That is one point. The next one, only in defining relative clauses, remember, we can replace who and which with that. We can use that instead of who and which if your relative clause is a defining one. The person who lived here is dead. This is a defining, again, another morbid example. Sorry for that. The person who lived here is dead. Who lived here is your relative clause, and it is a defining one. So you could simply remove who and put that. We could say the person that lived here is dead. And another one, look, one example with a non-defining relative clause. My cousin, because when I say my cousin, it means I have given the essential information about the person I'm talking about. So this is giving extra information. Still, if you want to decide if a piece of information is essential or non-essential, you should know the context, you should know the circumstances. It is not that simple. So we cannot always say that if this piece of information is essential or extra. But when it is extra, we need to put it between two forms of punctuation. My cousin, comma, who lived here, comma, is dead. So this one, we cannot use that instead of who. Why? Because of this rule in here. We cannot use that instead of who and which in non-defining relative clauses. The next important thing we want to talk about is leaving out relative pronouns. It means removing them from the sentence without any change in the meaning of the sentence. Let me explain on the examples. Look at this one. This is the man who talked to me. Okay, what is our relative clause? Our relative clause is this part, who talked to me. And who is our relative pronoun, which is replacing the man. And who is the subject of the clause. Because who talked to me? The man talked to me. So it is the subject of your clause. Now let's compare it with the next example here. This is the man who I talked to. Again, this is your relative clause. And who is the relative pronoun, which is again replacing the man. But this time, who is the object of the clause? Because we have a new subject, I. When you have who or which or that, so let me write it in here, who, which, and that, only in defining clauses. So remember, we cannot leave out relative pronouns from non-defining relative clauses. We can only do that in defining relative clauses, and not always. Only when our relative pronoun is the object of the clause. You don't have to remove it, but you have the option of removing it. So we could say, this is the man I talked to. This is the house I want to buy. You don't need to mention which. This is the house which I want to buy, because you in the clause you have a new subject, I, or this is the house they want to see. And with who, which, and that, you can leave them out of the sentence only in defining relative clauses and only when they are the objects of the relative clause. Look, remember we talked about bringing the preposition before whom and making it sound more polite and sound much more formal? I have brought that example again in here. This is the man to whom I talk to. Because again, you could replace who with whom in these two examples. Because, in this example in here, this is the subject. We cannot use whom. This is the object. We can use whom. But we decided to use who. As I told you, it doesn't make much difference when it is daily spoken language, especially. But when you use whom and you bring the preposition before whom, you cannot remove it from the sentence anymore. You have to keep it there. Although we have a new subject, but it doesn't mean that you can leave out the relative pronoun. And the last example, before we get to the exercises, is a very interesting one. This is about the importance of punctuation. When you want to determine the difference between a defining relative clause and a non-defining relative clause. Look at these two identical sentences. The only difference between these two sentences is this pair of commas in here. So again, as I told you, we don't have commas in here, so this should be a defining relative clause, and this should be a non-defining relative clause. But it is not only about the punctuation, guys. It is about the meaning of the sentences. Actually, two different meanings could be derived from these two sentences. When we say his brother who lives in Sydney is 40, you cannot remove this from the sentence. It means you are defining his brother. It means that person has more than one brother. Okay, so let's assume that you are reading either of these sentences in a novel. So it is very helpful if you know the role of punctuation in a non-defining relative clause. His brother, this is a non-defining one. It means you can remove it from the sentence and the meaning will be or will stay intact. His brother is 40. It means that person only has one brother. So, has more than one brother and only one brother. This is the importance of punctuation in defining the difference between a defining relative clause and a non-defining relative clause. Let's start with the exercises. Underline the correct word in each sentence. A. An old man who or which. We're talking about a man, so we're talking about people. So our option is who and not which. Who was carrying a suitcase knocked at the door. And by the way, this is a non-defining relative clause because it is giving essential information. It is giving extra information, not essential information. And we put them in between two commas. B. The winner, which or whose bike was an unusual design, won a medal. You're right, the answer is whose, because the word after whose belongs to the word before whose. We say the bike belongs to the winner, so the answer is whose. The relative pronoun we use here is whose. And our relative clause is a non-defining one because it is giving extra information and you can simply remove it from the sentence. The winner won a medal. C. The girl, again we're talking about a person, so the answer is who. The girl who spoke to me turned out to be in my class. And this is a defining relative clause because apart from no punctuation on both sides of the relative clause, it is defining the girl because we don't know which girl. We say the girl. What girl? The girl who spoke to me. D. The museum which or whose? The answer is which, because we are talking about museum as a thing, and this is a non-defining relative clause. Again, we have two commas here and here. The museum was closed, because we all know which museum we are talking about. We don't need to define it. So this is a non-defining relative clause. E. A policewoman that or which. We know that we can use that instead of who in defining relative clauses, and we cannot use which for people. And this is a defining relative clause. A policewoman, which policewoman? A policewoman that we asked told us about, told us how to get there. F. The boy whose house or whom house, again, because the house belongs to the boy, so our relative pronoun is whose, and this is a defining relative pronoun, the relative clause, because we say the boy. What boy? The boy whose house I was staying at was an old friend. G. The last person, which or who's been. We know that which, we cannot use which with persons, so the answer should be whose, but we need to make sure that the word which comes after whose belongs to the word before it. So the last person whose pen, so the pen belongs to the person, and this is a defining relative clause. We say the last person. What last person? The last person whose pen I borrowed didn't get it back. Okay, next exercise. Complete each sentence with who, whose, or that. Then say if they could be left out. It means if we can remove the relative pronouns from the sentence without any changes in meaning. Number 1. The friend whose house I stayed in, because again, in here, the house, the word after the relative pronoun belongs to the word before the relative pronoun. So the house belongs to the friend. And this is a defining relative clause. And we cannot remove whose, because there are no conditions in which, we could remove whose from a relative clause. Number 2, the guidebook that we bought, because our options are who, whose, and that we could use instead of which and who. So in the guidebook we are talking about a thing, so our relative pronoun should be that, and this is a defining one. The guidebook that we bought explained everything. So the question is, could we remove this from the sentence? The answer is yes, because of two reasons. 1, this is a defining relative clause, and 2, we have a new subject in the relative clause. Number 3, the couple whose house I bought. Again, the house, the word after the relative pronoun belongs to the word before the relative pronoun. So the answer should be whose, and we can never remove whose from a sentence. Number 4, I'd like you to tell me who you were talking to. I'd like you to tell me who you were talking to. In here, who cannot be removed from the sentence because, look, this is not a relative clause. This is a question. We call it an indirect question. So the original question was, who were you talking to? This is a question. Now we are asking it in an indirect way. We say, I'd like you to tell me who you were talking to. So this is not a relative clause. This is just an indirect question. And we cannot remove who from an indirect question. Like, for example, when you want to ask an address from somebody in the street, you say, can I ask you where the post office is? This is an indirect question. This is not a relative clause. So you shouldn't confuse these two with each other. Number 5, the girl. Okay, so again, this is another indirect question. Look, it is not so hard to tell the difference between indirect questions and relative clauses, because relative clauses are there to define a noun or a noun phrase. Look at number 1. It says,
The friend, which friend? The guidebook, which guidebook? The couple, which couple? But in here it says, I'd like you to tell me. There is nothing to be like given essential or extra information about. Tell me who you were talking to. This is an indirect question. Number 5, we say the girl, which girl or what girl? We need to define the girl. But in here it says, I can't remember. Remember is a verb. We are not defining or giving essential or extra information about anything. So this is again an indirect question. This is not a relative clause. So you shouldn't mix them up. Number 7. This is the company. Again, in here, something needs to be defining. This is the company. What company? This is the company that Catherine works for. And this shouldn't be a question, actually. So, the thing is, could we remove that from the sentence or not? Yes, we can, because this is a relative clause, and this is a defining relative clause, and we have a new subject in the relative clause, Catherine. So we can, yes, we can remove it from the sentence, or we can leave it out. Next exercise. Underline relative pronouns which can be left out in these sentences. A. The book that John was reading was a bit frightening. So, this is a defining or a non-defining. This is a defining relative clause because apart from not having any punctuations, but the thing is we say the book, what book? We need to define that book. That John was reading. And besides, we have a new subject in here in the relative clause. So, yes, we can remove that from the sentence. B. The travel agency which sold me the ticket was near my office. The first question you need to be asking yourself is this a defining or a non-defining relative clause? This is a defining relative clause because we say the travel agency. We could ask what travel agency? And besides, sometimes, you have the punctuation in here which tells you this is a non-defining one. So this is not a non-defining one. This is a defining one. So the next question is, do we have a new subject after the relative pronoun? We don't, so we cannot remove it from the sentence. C. In the end, our holiday was the best that we had ever had. This is a defining relative clause, so for the first question checks. Our holiday was the best that we had ever had. And besides, we have a new subject in here, so yes, we can remove it from the sentence. It means we can say, in the end, our holiday was the best we had ever had. D. The dentist who I go to isn't very expensive. Again, this is a defining one. Next question. Do we have a new subject after the relative pronoun? Yes, we do. And this is who, which is one of the relative pronouns which could be removed from the sentence. It means we could simply say, the dentist I go to isn't very expensive. E. The film which we saw last week was much better than this one. Again, the film. What film? So this is a defining one. Next question. Do we have a new subject? Yes, we do. So yes, we can remove it from the sentence. We could say, the film we saw last week was much better than this one. F. The people who were leaving couldn't find their coats. The people. What people? The people who were leaving. The first question checks. This is a defining relative clause. The next question, do we have a new subject after the relative pronoun? No, we don't. So no, we cannot remove it from the sentence. G. The garden, which wasn't very large, was full of flowers. In here, the first question doesn't check because this is a non-defining relative clause and we cannot remove or leave out the relative pronouns from a non-defining relative clause.
Okay guys, thanks for watching another episode of English Grammar with Max. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have any suggestions or if you have any questions, you can ask me in the comment section and I will do my best to address and answer to them. Thank you. See you next time.